I first said that to myself when I was 20 or 21 and had already published 5 books and was in the midst of yet another. Shortly, I rewrote it in an early essay. What I remember myself saying was, I write the books or stories I want to read, but can't find on bookstore shelf or paperback book rack. I would have thought something like that had even made it into some early essay or interview, but half an hour online turns up only the Gizmodo version, and an interview I did last year. In the midst of writing my first published book, however, The Jewels of Aptor, 1962, I realized one evening when I was trying to be overly modest during an eagerly awaited dinner visit by W. H. Auden and Chester Kallman, it was February 1962, that the book I was in the midst of writing was the most important thing I felt I had undertaken. A little later, when I was still 19, I sat in the wood-framed red easy chair my mother-in-law had sent down with a lot of broken china as a house gift from my young wife and me. Marilyn was out at work that day and I was home. I remember thinking of the various people who, only a few years before, were constantly coming around to my parents' apartment in Morningside Gardens and saying they would be willing to get me a position at a really good-paying job. All I had to do was knock on their office door or give them a phone call and set up an appointment. Many had been fairly successful black businessmen who felt it was their responsibility to help out the new generation of young marrieds. I'd also realized it was likely that if I did take them up on any of those offers, I'd have been on my way to a $10,000 a year job in a decade or so, and $10,000 a year at that time was the equivalent of more than $100,000 today. I mumbled to myself loud enough so that somebody might have been able to hear me if they had been in the room with me. I am never going to make that kind of money. I will be lucky if I make enough to survive. My first novel was sold a few months later to Ace Books for $1,000. That was also the time when our rent on a 4-room apartment in the East Village on the dead end of East 5th Street was $52 a month, which had been brought down from $58 when the city inspectors had come around and discovered that the landlord was charging $6 over the maximum for a building with that level of plumbing. In short, our rent was $624 a year. Marilyn had a job in which she was making approximately $80 a week as an assistant editor at the paperback publishing company that had accepted my first novel as an anonymous submission. That was a livable wage. I managed to lose most of the first half of that $1,000 in a way that I am still too embarrassed to talk about, but within a year I sold another novel, the first of a trilogy that was completed and contracted for before my 21st birthday, and I had learned my lesson about the money I was bringing in. Section 5. We lived in that building for 4 years before we moved to another building, 739 East 6th Street, apartment 4F. One of the objects we had bought first was a wooden 4-drawer filing cabinet. It came from a second-hand furniture store 2 or 3 blocks away from where we lived, a little to the west and south, and we rolled it back on a convenient dolly that the store loaned us. When we moved to the new apartment, a block north and east in Alphabet City, it was the first object transported by a helpful neighborhood heroin addict, on another borrowed dolly, who was not more than 2 years older than I was. A white kid, 20 or 21, he was very proud that he had a good reputation in the neighborhood. He'd been born there, and said that too many people knew him for him to be a thief or to break the law in any way other than his heroin habit. Fairly presentable, as such people go. He did have the most badly bitten fingernails I think I have ever seen on another human being. I wish I remembered his name. He was a neighborhood character whom we saw on the street many places, and whom one regularly said hello to. Once we moved, however, in another year or two, he disappeared from my landscape for 10 or 11 years, then turned up again one afternoon in the lobby of the Albert Hotel, where I was staying during one of the periods when Marilyn and I were no longer living together, and the number of published science fiction novels had gone up to 9.